What if your marriage began with a contract instead of a heartbeat? And what if the person you were told to stand beside became the only one who truly saw the cracks inside you? Evelyn Bennett never dreamed her life would come down to a name on paper. But when her father's empire crumbled and survival meant sacrifice, she was handed a future already chosen, forged by legacy, not love. Charles Whitmore had never asked for affection, only order, silence, control. He didn't believe in emotion. He believed in outcomes. So when the two strangers agreed to marry for convenience, it was supposed to be simple. No promises, no feelings, no risk. But what happens when something real begins to grow inside the spaces between their rules? When control starts to unravel and trust feels more terrifying than betrayal? Can a partnership built on strategy evolve into a bond neither of them were prepared for? And if love does find its way into an arranged life, will they be brave enough to fight for it? If you believe in slow burn intimacy, in honesty over perfection, and in love that waits quietly to be chosen, like this video, share it with someone who still believes in second chances, and subscribe to Shining Stories. Now, let's begin. The sitting room was cloaked in an unsettling quiet. It wasn't the kind of silence that calmed, it was the kind that pressed down on your chest, refusing to let go. Evelyn stared at her father, confusion and disbelief swirling behind her eyes. She had known this conversation would change things. She just didn't realize how deeply. Promised. The word fell from her lips like ash. You're not serious, are you, Mr. Bennett turned his gaze toward the fireplace. The flames danced, casting shadows on his face, warm in appearance, but not in feeling. Evelyn, I wish I were joking, he said softly. But our situation is more fragile than you know. And Charles Whitmore, he can offer us a future we can't secure on our own. Her breath caught. Charles Whitmore. The name alone tightened something inside her. She'd heard of him. Who hadn't? A man of old money and unspoken power. Respected by some, feared by others. Calculated, private, cold. And now, her fiancé. You didn't even ask me. Her voice was shaking, but it held its ground. Marriage isn't some legal arrangement. It's supposed to mean something. For you, maybe. Her father murmured. For him, it's business. But for us, it's survival. He reached for her hand, his touch tender, but unyielding. He's a man of influence. He can give you stability. He paused, his voice thickening, and maybe love, if you let it grow. Evelyn blinked hard, refusing to cry. I'm not a pawn, Dad. I won't be paraded around like a symbol of success. I know, sweetheart, Mr. Bennett replied. But life doesn't always offer clean choices. Sometimes, the doors we resent the most lead us to places we never imagined. She looked away, the weight of his words pressing on her like stone. A stranger, that's who Charles Whitmore was. And yet, a strange flicker of curiosity had begun to stir. Why would a man like him agree to this? What did he stand to gain? Later that week, Evelyn sat stiffly in a grand hotel lobby, her hands gripped tightly around her leather purse strap. The polished marble floors shimmered beneath her feet. Above, a chandelier poured light like liquid diamonds. Everything around her screamed wealth, control, power. And yet, none of it could quiet the storm in her chest. Her father had told her where and when to meet him. Charles Whitmore, 6 p.m., sharp. Her heart pounded in rhythm with the antique clock ticking on the far wall. Then a figure entered the room, tall, composed, unapologetically elegant in a charcoal gray suit. He moved like someone used to being watched, his eyes gray, unreadable, locked onto hers. And in that moment, Evelyn felt the world slow to a crawl. A chill ran through Evelyn's spine as she stood. Before her stood the man Charles Whitmore. He extended his hand, firm, confident, entirely unreadable. Miss Bennett, I presume, he said. His voice was exactly what she'd imagined, deep, composed, with an undercurrent of quiet command. Yes, she replied, barely above a whisper, though her tone didn't waver. She shook his hand, noting the calm strength in his grip, then quickly released it, resisting the urge to pull back further. "Thank you for meeting me," Charles continued, his expression polite but distant. "I'm aware this arrangement isn't exactly ideal." She took a breath, steadying herself. Meeting his gaze, she replied, "Ideal might be the most generous word you could have chosen, Mr. Whitmore." A faint smile played at the corner of his lips, small, almost imperceptible. "Call me Charles," he said with a nod. "We're about to be family, after all." He gestured to a quiet corner of the lobby, where two chairs awaited. Reluctantly, she followed. As they sat, his tone remained measured. "I understand you may feel cornered, but I want to make this as practical and as livable as possible for both of us." "Livable," she echoed, raising an eyebrow. "That's a rather charming choice of words." Charles looked at her with a hint of amusement, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I value honesty. It saves time. We both know why this is happening. I'm not here to sell illusions or make promises I can't keep. My focus is legacy. This alliance, our marriage, supports that." The directness stunned her, not in a cruel way, but in how plain and unvarnished it was. She had expected arrogance or false sweetness, but instead, he was laying it bare. "And what about me?" she asked at last, her voice sharper now. "Do you expect me to simply fall in line because it helps your image?" His gaze softened, just slightly. "No, I don't intend to control you, Evelyn. This won't be a cage, not for either of us. But I do need a partner, someone who can stand beside me publicly, without question." He paused. "In return, you'll have freedom, stability, control over your own life within reason." Her heart beat faster. He was blunt, calculated, but not deceitful, and in some odd way, that gave her a strange sense of comfort. "I can agree to that," she said at last, after a silence that felt like it stretched forever, but only under one condition. He leaned in slightly, intrigued. "I'm listening. If I'm going to be your wife," she said, voice now firm, "I need respect, not obedience. I need to keep my life, my identity, and above all, I want dignity. A marriage built on that, or not at all." Charles looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then slowly, he nodded. "Fair enough. Evelyn, I can live with that." For the first time that day, something shifted. It wasn't affection, not yet, but it was a beginning, a small thread of mutual understanding. Days later, Evelyn arrived at Whitmore Manor. It stood like something from another time, grand, imposing, beautiful in the kind of way that made you feel small. Charles had insisted she see it before they moved forward. Inside, she was greeted by a quiet, professional housekeeper. They moved through wide corridors lined with oil paintings and glimmering chandeliers. Everything sparkled. Everything was perfect. And yet, it felt hollow, like a place meant to be admired, not lived in. The manor was exquisite, but cold, not in temperature, but in spirit. Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't a place to live. It was a place meant to impress. She wondered if Charles was the same way, polished and presentable on the outside, but emotionally unreachable. Eventually, she was led to a private study. The doors opened to reveal a vast, wood-paneled room with towering bookshelves and a heavy oak desk that looked older than the country itself. Charles sat behind it. His fingers tapped a slow, steady rhythm on the polished surface, his gaze fixed on something far away. But as she entered, he stood with quiet courtesy. "Miss Bennett," he said evenly, "I trust the journey here was smooth." "It was. Thank you," Evelyn replied, glancing around. "Your home is remarkable." He gave a short nod. "I wanted you to see it for yourself. Find where you'd feel most at ease. Any part of the house can be adjusted to your liking." She looked at him, surprised. "You're offering me freedom here within reason," he said with the faintest trace of a smile. "We'll share this space. I'd rather you feel comfortable in it." It wasn't affection, but it was consideration. And somehow, That meant more than empty charm. I appreciate that, she said quietly. It's more than I expected. Charles stepped from behind the desk, his movements calm and purposeful. The closer he came, the more palpable his presence felt, not aggressive, but intense, like gravity. There's something you should understand, he began, his voice softer now. This agreement, unusual as it may be, comes with expectations, public appearances, dinners, events. We'll need to present a united front. He paused, as if choosing his next words with care. I'm not asking you to be someone you're not. Outside of those moments, I'm simply Charles, and you're free to live as you choose, within the terms we've agreed upon. Evelyn felt something shift inside her, a strange combination of relief and unease. He was giving her space, but there was still a boundary, a line he wouldn't or couldn't cross. I suppose we have an understanding, she said, her voice steady now. As long as you respect my independence, I'll respect this arrangement. Charles looked like he might say something else, something more, but instead, he nodded. Good. I'll have the staff show you to your suite. We'll move forward with the ceremony preparations soon. Evelyn turned to leave, her pulse louder than she wanted to admit. But before she reached the door, his voice called out once more. Evelyn. She stopped, slowly turned back. His eyes met hers, calm, but no longer cold. If this becomes too much, this arrangement, I'd rather you tell me. I can live with the truth, but I won't live a lie, not even one of convenience. Her breath caught. For just a moment, he seemed human, not the powerful, untouchable man people whispered about, but someone uncertain, someone alone. I will, she said softly, and I hope you'll do the same. Then she stepped through the door, feeling his gaze trail her like a memory. Their marriage might have been born of necessity, but beneath the terms, beneath the roles and the rituals, a question waited quietly. Could something real grow from something arranged? The night of the engagement gala arrived, a spectacle as much about image as it was about intent. Evelyn stood quietly in her dressing room, her reflection staring back at her from a tall mirror framed in gold. She wore a sleek, midnight blue gown, simple, elegant, yet commanding. Diamond earrings sparkled just beneath her hair, and at her collarbone rested a delicate necklace Charles had sent earlier that day. She looked beautiful, poised, almost untouchable, and yet it felt like she was dressing for someone else's life. A soft knock broke her thoughts. She turned. Charles stood in the doorway, impeccably dressed in a black tuxedo that seemed tailored not just to his body but to his presence. For a fleeting second, he didn't say a word. He simply looked at her, and something in his eyes softened. You look perfect, he said quietly, his voice carrying a rare warmth that she hadn't expected. Thank you, Evelyn whispered, her cheeks betraying her with a subtle flush. He extended his arm. Shall we? She hesitated, then slipped her hand into the crook of his arm. There was strength beneath the calm surface, and she let him lead her down the sweeping staircase. Applause greeted them the moment they entered the grand ballroom. All eyes turned. All whispers paused. Evelyn felt the weight of every gaze. But beside her, Charles was steady, composed. His presence grounded her in a way she hadn't anticipated. They moved through the room as though choreographed polite smiles, soft laughter, hands clasped, faces red. Charles navigated each conversation with practiced ease, his quiet authority earning respect and perhaps a touch of fear. Then, an older woman approached, elegant, watchful. She leaned in with a knowing smile, her pearls catching the chandelier light. So, you're the woman who's managed to steal Mr. Whitmore's heart, she said, her tone sweet but curious. Tell me. Dear, how did you two meet? Evelyn hesitated, her gaze flickering to Charles for help, without missing a beat. He spoke, his voice low and reassuring. It was a meeting, arranged by fate, he said, eyes never leaving hers. We were both searching for stability, something lasting. I found that in Evelyn. The words, though likely spoken for the crowd, landed in her heart with unexpected weight. There was truth hidden inside them, maybe more truth than either of them wanted to admit aloud. As the evening wore on, Evelyn allowed herself to be drawn into the rhythm of it all. Charles never left her side. His touch was constant, but never possessive. His glances subtle, but grounding. It felt surreal, like they were playing roles they hadn't rehearsed. Yet, somehow, the performance was seamless. Later, they found themselves alone on a quiet balcony. The city shimmered below like scattered stars. Soft music drifted through the open doors. Charles turned toward her, his expression gentler than she'd ever seen. "Thank you," he said softly. "For tonight. You were remarkable." Evelyn met his gaze, her heart unexpectedly full. "I didn't think I'd feel this comfortable," she admitted. "But with you, it was easier." There was a silence, not heavy, but suspended, like breath held too long. He reached for her hand, his thumb brushing lightly across her knuckles, and in his eyes. For the first time, she saw not the tycoon, not the strategist, but the man. "This isn't the life you would have chosen," Charles said quietly, his eyes holding hers with an unfamiliar softness. "But I'll do everything I can to make it a life you'll want to stay in." Evelyn felt something shift inside her. The quiet resentment that had clung to her heart for weeks began to lift, not completely, but enough to let in a breath of hope. Maybe this marriage could become something more than a contract. The gala had marked a turning point. In the days that followed, Evelyn moved some of her belongings into Whitmore Manor. Her world was changing room by room, detail by detail. The mansion, once so intimidating, now began to feel less foreign. Not quite hers, not yet, but no longer someone else's entirely. Still, there was an uneasiness she couldn't shake. The role she was stepping into, Charles' wife, felt like trying on a coat tailored for another woman. One evening, after hours of planning, meetings, and unspoken expectations, she retreated to her suite, hoping for solitude. But when she entered, she found him, Charles, standing quietly in the adjoining room that connected their quarters. "You've had a long day," he said, watching her gently. "I just wanted to check in, see how you're settling." It caught her off guard. He rarely spoke like this, rarely lingered. She set down her bag and sat on the edge of the bed. "It's strange," she admitted. "Everything here is so perfect, yet sometimes it feels like I'm just living in someone else's story." He walked closer, his face softening. "This home, it's yours now too. You don't have to change who you are to belong here." His voice wasn't romantic, but it was sincere, and something in her chest stirred. It wasn't flowers or promises, but it was truth. A question rose in her, one she'd held back since the beginning. "Charles," she asked slowly, "why did you agree to this arrangement?" He paused. She saw something flicker across his face, something real. When he spoke, his voice was lower than before. "I've spent most of my life alone," he said. "I thought that was what I wanted: freedom, control, space to build everything on my own terms." He exhaled. "But wealth and power, they come with their own kind of silence, a kind that follows you home and sits with you in every room." She felt a twinge of sympathy. It was the first time he let her see behind the mask. He stepped closer. "What started as formality is beginning to feel like something else," he said. "A partnership. Perhaps." Evelyn hesitated, searching his eyes. "Partnership," she echoed. She wasn't sure if it sounded comforting or dangerous. "Yes," he replied softly, reaching for her hand. "I won't offer false romance. I don't know how, but I can give you honesty, respect, and maybe, with time, something deeper will grow." Her breath caught. There was no grand declaration, but there was sincerity. Still, she spoke what lingered in her heart. "And what if I want more than honesty? Charles, what if I want something real: connection? not just arrangement. He fell silent. His eyes met hers, and he didn't look away. After a long pause, he answered, "Then I'd ask you to give me a chance. Let me show you that I can become more than what I've been." Evelyn didn't answer right away, but she didn't walk away either. Her heart was uncertain, but open. And maybe that was a beginning too. They stood there, suspended in a silence that didn't need to be filled, a silence that carried the weight of possibilities and promises not yet spoken. Evelyn could feel something shifting inside her. The walls she had so carefully built around her heart were beginning to soften, and in Charles's eyes, cool. Controlled, she saw something raw, something human. He was just as uncertain as she was, both of them trying to navigate a future they hadn't chosen, but maybe could grow into. Then, "Let's take it one day at a time," she said quietly, her voice almost lost in the stillness. "For now, a partnership sounds like a good beginning." A small smile tugged at the corners of his lips, the first she'd seen that felt real. "One day at a time," he echoed. His hand lingered on hers, and in that quiet moment, Evelyn felt something she hadn't expected: hope. The days passed, then the weeks, and to her surprise, a quiet rhythm began to form between them. They shared breakfasts in the sun-drenched dining room, conversations that began formally, but slowly warmed into something easier. Charles was a man of habit, measured and thoughtful, but she started to notice the little things, how he remembered how she took her tea, how he didn't rush her when she needed quiet, how he listened, really listened, when she spoke. One evening, Evelyn wandered into the library. The air smelled of old paper and soft wood polish. She found him there, sitting in a deep leather chair near the fire, a book resting open in his hands. The firelight flickered across his face, softening his features. For once, he looked at peace. He glanced up and gestured gently. "You're welcome to join me, if you'd like." She gave a small smile and settled into the chair across from him. They sat in a silence that didn't need explaining. Comfortable, easy. Eventually, curiosity got the better of her. "What are you reading?" she asked. Without a word, he held up the cover, Pride and Prejudice. Evelyn blinked. She hadn't expected that. Not from him. Charles chuckled, a quiet, deep sound that surprised her. "I usually stick to finance reports," he said, "but I've been curious. People seem drawn to these stories. I wanted to understand why." She couldn't help the grin that crossed her face. "Are you trying to study romance?" A faint blush colored his cheeks just barely, but it was there, and for the first time, he looked boyish. "Maybe I am," he said, meeting her gaze. "I'm realizing there's more to life than what I've allowed myself to feel." A silence followed, but this one felt heavier, more thoughtful. "Charles," she began softly, "have you ever been in love?" His eyes drifted to the flames, and for a moment, he didn't speak. "No," he said at last, barely above a whisper. "I've spent so long trying to keep control. Love, it doesn't fit into boxes. It's unpredictable, I guess. I kept it out because I couldn't manage it." Evelyn felt a pang in her chest, not pity but understanding. He had built his life with precision, but in doing so, had built walls so high, even he couldn't see over them. "I didn't grow up with much," she said, her voice gentle, "but I had love. Family, friends, even heartbreak. It wasn't always easy, but it made life real." She looked at the book in his lap. "And maybe that's why we read stories like this, because they remind us that being vulnerable, being open, isn't weakness. It's what makes us human." Charles studied her, his gaze steady, intense, but no longer guarded. "Do you think—" He paused, as though afraid to ask. "Do you believe we could have that, Evelyn, in this marriage of ours?" Her heart skipped. The question, so unexpected, opened a door she hadn't dared to look behind, not until now. She met his eyes. "I think—" Her voice was soft. "But sure, if we're both willing to try, then maybe, yes." But it won't happen all at once. Love doesn't work like that. It's not something you can plan or control. Charles nodded slowly, as if her words were settling into the quiet corners of his mind. And for the first time, he seemed to understand. This wasn't about respect or formality anymore. It was about trust, letting go of control, risking something real. The fire crackled gently beside them as they sat together saying nothing, but sharing everything. There, in the soft flicker of light, something shifted, unspoken, undefined, but very much felt. That night, they talked for hours about nothing and everything, childhood memories, stories from holidays long past, books, music, old dreams that had been buried beneath adulthood. They laughed, they listened, they let their walls down. And Evelyn saw him, truly saw him, not the businessman, not the figure in tailored suits, but the man beneath it all, quiet, wounded, hopeful. Later, Charles walked her to her suite, at the door. He paused. He took her hand gently, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. His touch was steady, warm. "Thank you, Evelyn," he said, voice low. "I haven't felt this close to someone in a long time." "Neither have I," she replied, holding his gaze. "I think we're starting to see each other." A small smile barely there touched his lips. "Good night, Evelyn. Good night, Charles." As he walked away, Evelyn stood there in silence, a fragile hope blooming quietly in her chest. Maybe this wasn't a transaction anymore. Maybe it could become something real. The weeks that followed brought both comfort and uncertainty. Evelyn had settled into the estate, but part of her still felt like a guest in a life too perfect to be hers. The doubt lingered. Was this real, or just a beautifully furnished illusion? Charles had been kind, considerate, but she wondered, was it duty that moved him, or something deeper? Was she his partner, or simply the answer to a legacy's demand? Those questions hung in the back of her mind, following her through dinners, meetings, and moments of quiet. But the rhythm between them had changed. It was no longer just about appearances. It was about presence, about trust, fragile and still forming. One evening, as the sun slipped beneath the horizon, Evelyn sat on the balcony, the wind gently brushing against her face. She heard footsteps. Charles. He sat beside her, quieter than usual. Something in his energy was different. He wasn't composed tonight. He looked worn and uncertain. "You've been distant lately," she said gently, not accusing, just honest. He stared into the sky, breathing in deeply. "I know." There was a long silence before he spoke again, and when he did, his voice was quieter than the wind between them. "I've been struggling with something," Charles said at last, his voice low, almost reluctant. "There's been a breach in the company, a leak. Someone close to me has been feeding confidential information to outsiders, and I have no idea who." Evelyn turned to face him, her heart tightening. This was the first time she had seen him, uncertain, not in control, not composed, just human. His gaze didn't meet hers. It was fixed on the horizon, far away, like he was afraid to look at her and see judgment in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said softly, reaching out without thinking. Her fingers found his, and she gave them a gentle squeeze. "I can't imagine how hard this must be." At her touch, he looked at her and she saw it. The exhaustion, the fear, the weight of a man who had always stood tall, now carrying too much to hide it. "I've spent my life building something solid," he said. "Something that could weather any storm. But this, it feels like betrayal. And I don't know who I can trust anymore." His thumb brushed over her knuckles, almost without realizing. "Trust," he whispered, "was always the one thing I depended on. And now, it's slipping." Evelyn felt the pressure of his words, the rawness, the helplessness. He wasn't just afraid of sabotage. He was afraid of losing the very thing that defined him: control. "Charles," she said quietly, I know we're still finding our way in this, whatever it is we're building, but I need you to know something." She paused, holding his gaze. "You can trust me. Whatever happens, I'm not going anywhere." He looked at her, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then, something in him softened. "You don't understand," he murmured, more to himself than to her. It's not just about the business. It's about losing control. Losing the one thing I've always had." Evelyn leaned in, her voice tender. "Then let me help you. Not to fix it, but just to be here. To be the one person you don't have to manage or calculate." For a long time, he said nothing. She feared she had gone too far, spoken too soon. But then quietly, almost hesitantly, he pulled her close, his arm wrapped around her shoulders, his forehead resting lightly against hers. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't know how to let people in, but with you, it feels different." Evelyn closed her eyes. For the first time, their closeness didn't feel complicated. It felt simple. They weren't playing roles. They weren't guarding their words. They were just two people, worn thin by life, trying maybe for the first time in a long while to be real with someone else. The stars sparkled above them, and for now, words were no longer necessary. "Not to fix it," Evelyn whispered, "but to be here, to be the one person you don't have to control." Charles didn't respond at first. She wondered if she'd crossed a line, spoken too boldly. But then, without a word, he reached out and gently pulled her closer. His arm wrapped around her shoulders. His head leaned against hers. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke louder than anything he could have said. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice raw with emotion. "I don't know how to let people in. I've never trusted easily. But with you, it feels different." Evelyn's chest tightened with something tender. She leaned into him, resting quietly in his embrace. In that moment, for the first time since they'd met, she didn't feel like a participant in an arrangement. She felt like a person, someone seen. The stars above twinkled in silent witness, and the night wrapped around them like a blanket. No titles, no expectations. Just two souls, fragile, real, trying to find a place where they both belonged. For now, being in each other's arms was enough. The weeks that followed moved with quiet rhythm. Their days were filled with small routines, morning coffee, soft conversations, shared glances in the hall. Charles was still immersed in his work, but something about him had changed. There was a softness now, a gentleness in the way he looked at her, a warmth that hadn't been there before. In public, he remained composed, private, controlled. But in the quiet spaces of their home, a new kind of closeness was forming. Still, Evelyn couldn't help but feel that parts of him remained locked away, as though some doors in his world were not meant for her to enter. Not yet. She didn't push, but sometimes the distance between them felt like a quiet ache. One evening, after a formal dinner with business associates, they walked side by side through the dimly lit hallway leading to their private quarters. Their footsteps echoed. Neither of them spoke, but Evelyn could see it. Charles was worn, his posture hunched ever so slightly, his eyes darker than usual, heavy with something unsaid. "Charles," she said softly, breaking the silence. "You need to slow down. You're exhausting yourself." He glanced at her, surprised by her gentleness. "I'm fine," he replied. "You don't have to worry." "But I do," she said, placing a hand on his arm. "You're not just tired from work. There's more going on, isn't there?" He hesitated, his expression clouded. She didn't press. She waited. Finally, he spoke. He exhaled deeply. "I'm not sure I can do all of this." His voice was barely a whisper now. "The company, this marriage, the expectations. I thought I could carry it all, but lately, I feel like everything is slipping through my hands." Evelyn's heart broke a little at his confession. This wasn't the man the world saw. This wasn't the billionaire or the strategist. This was a man, tired, afraid, alone. She stepped closer, took both his hands in hers. "You don't have to do it alone," she said quietly. I'm not expecting you to be perfect. I just want to be here, beside you, through it all. A week later, Evelyn found him in his study. The early morning light spilled across the room, casting long shadows over the polished floor. Charles sat at his desk, motionless, his gaze lost in the view beyond the glass. There was no paper in front of him, no laptop, just silence and thought. Evelyn paused at the doorway, uncertain. She didn't want to intrude, but something in her heart urged her forward. Charles, she said gently, stepping inside. He turned his head slightly, offering a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Good morning, Evelyn. Good morning, she replied. You've been here a while, haven't you? He nodded. There's always something to do, he muttered, then added, more quietly, but that's not all. There are choices I need to make, and not all of them are in my control. She heard it then, the tension behind his words, not just business pressure, something deeper. Charles sat in silence, his shoulders tight, his eyes distant. The pressure around him was thick, palpable. It wasn't just the business. It was everything he had built, and everything he feared he might lose. Evelyn took a step closer. You don't have to carry all of this alone, she said gently. But when he turned to her, his expression was sharper than she expected. I don't have a choice, he snapped. I don't have the luxury of falling apart. Evelyn, I'm the one expected to hold everything together. The sudden rise in his voice startled her, but she didn't flinch. She stayed rooted because she understood now. This wasn't about pride. It was about fear. A deep fear that if he let go, everything would collapse, not just the empire he built, but himself. You don't have to keep everything locked inside, she said calmly. We're not in this alone anymore. You have me now. Let me share the weight. He didn't respond at first. His jaw clenched, and his eyes fell to the floor. Conflict raged behind his silence. Finally, he stood up from the desk, his movements sharp, restless. I don't know how to let go, he said, voice strained. I don't know how to trust someone enough to lean on them, even with you. I'm still not sure I can. Evelyn's heart ached for him. I don't need you to be perfect, she said, stepping closer. I just need you to trust me. Let me carry part of this. Let me be the one person you don't have to protect yourself from. His gaze softened, but hesitation still flickered behind his eyes. He had lived so long inside his fortress of strength to step outside it, even for her, felt like walking into a storm without armor. I'm scared, he whispered, barely able to form the words. I'm scared that if I let go, everything will fall apart. Evelyn reached out, resting her hand on his arm, grounding him. It's okay to be scared, she said softly, but fear doesn't mean you're weak. It means you care, and you're not alone in this. The silence stretched again, fragile and long. Then he let out a slow, deep breath. His shoulders sagged ever so slightly. You make it sound so simple, he said, his voice carrying a faint trace of wonder. I wish I could believe that. You don't have to believe it all today, Evelyn replied. Just take the first step. His eyes met hers, and for the first time in weeks, she saw something new, a flicker of hope, a quiet surrender. I'll try, he said, barely audible, and I'll be here, she answered without hesitation. I'm not giving up on you. Those words, soft and unwavering, were enough to shift something between them. It wasn't sudden, it wasn't cinematic, but it was real. The next morning, golden light filtered softly through the tall bedroom windows. Evelyn lay awake, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. Part of her had hoped that last night's conversation would be the breakthrough, that things would feel different, lighter, but something still lingered in the air. Charles had been quiet since then, more present but distant, as though every step closer they took revealed how much further they still had to go. She sat up slowly, her heart filled with questions she wasn't sure how or when to ask. The more they reached for each other, the more she feared they might be slipping through the space between them. And still, she wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Evelyn had learned to read the smallest shifts in him, the way his jaw tightened ever so slightly, the way his eyes grew distant when he thought no one noticed. He was still holding on not just to his world, but to the fear of losing control. Even with her, he hadn't quite let go. A sound from the hallway pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to see Charles standing at the door, immaculate as always in a tailored suit, but with something unspoken written across his face. "Morning," he said, voice calm, too calm, but there was a quiet storm just beneath it. "Good morning," she replied softly, sitting up on the edge of the bed. "How are you?" His gaze flickered just for a second, then steadied. "Busy, full day ahead, meetings, calls." He paused, then added more deliberately, "But we need to talk." The room shifted, the air thickened. This wasn't casual, this was the conversation. Evelyn stood and walked slowly toward him. "Talk about what?" He looked at her, his eyes conflicted. "Everything," he said simply. "I need you to understand something about me. I'm not the kind of man who knows how to be what you want. I don't know if I can be." Her heart beat faster, but she didn't flinch. "I never asked you to be anyone else." "Charles," she said, her voice steady, "I just want you to be real, to let me see the parts of you you've kept hidden, not because you have to, but because you trust me to." He turned away, running a hand through his hair, frustration creeping into his posture. "You don't understand," he said. "I've lived with this fear for so long. Fear of losing control. Fear of being seen as weak. I thought I could keep it all buried. But now, I don't know." Evelyn stepped closer, gently placing a hand on his arm. "It's okay to be afraid," she said. "We all are. But you don't have to face it alone. Let me be there with you." His jaw tightened, emotion rising fast, too fast to contain. "You don't get it," he snapped, his voice rising. "If I let go, I lose everything. My business, my name, my reputation. Everything I've built could fall apart." She didn't back away. Her voice softened, but it was firm. "Is that really what you believe? That your worth is tied only to what you've built, to a name, a legacy?" His eyes met hers, and in them, finally, she saw the cracks. "What if that's all I have?" he whispered. "Then I'm here," she said gently, "to show you that you're more than your empire, more than your past. You are more, Charles." Silence fell between them, heavy, fragile, full of everything left unsaid. Evelyn could see the battle in him between the man he had been for years and the man he might become if he allowed himself to try. "I don't know if I'm strong enough," he whispered, "to let all of this go." "You don't have to be perfect," she replied, her hand lifting to his face. "You don't need every answer. Just trust me. Trust us." Charles closed his eyes, a long breath escaping from somewhere deep within. When he opened them again, there was something new in his eyes, a glimmer, a quiet flicker of hope, as if the fortress he had spent a lifetime building was finally beginning to crack. "I'll try," Charles said, his voice low, but steady. "And that was enough." "That's all I need," Evelyn replied, her voice filled with warmth. "I'll be here, every step of the way." They stood there, hands clasped, the quiet between them no longer empty, but full of possibility. It wouldn't be easy. There would be doubts, missteps, and silence that needed patience. But for the first time, they weren't standing on opposite sides of a chasm. They were facing the unknown, together uncertain, but no longer alone. The days that followed felt like a quiet turning point. Evelyn began noticing the little things, the way Charles no longer flinched when vulnerability crept into a conversation, the way he sometimes reached for her hand without even realizing, how his presence began to feel less like a wall and more like a door slowly opening. But the past didn't disappear. Not entirely. He still carried it, the weight of his empire, the burden of every decision that had shaped him, the haunting thought that at any moment it could all fall apart. He was still Charles Whitmore, powerful, guarded, deeply afraid of unraveling. But Evelyn had made him a promise, And she was determined to show him that love wasn't about holding everything together. It was about letting someone in, even when you feared being seen too clearly. It was late one evening when Evelyn found herself back in the room where everything had quietly begun. The study, the space where they had exchanged honesty and whispers and silences, where something practical had started to feel deeply personal. Charles sat hunched at his desk, bathed in the golden glow of a small lamp. He looked tired, not just physically, but tired of holding it all in. Yet something was different. He wasn't resisting her presence anymore. He was waiting for it. "Charles," she said softly, leaning against the doorway. He looked up, and this time, his gaze was unguarded, open, almost tender. "I didn't hear you come in," he said, his voice steady, but gentler than usual. "I didn't want to interrupt," she replied, stepping into the room. "You've been buried in work lately." He sighed, setting the papers aside. "It's what I know how to do," he admitted. "If I stay busy, I don't have to deal with everything else." She moved closer. "And what is everything else?" He hesitated. His eyes shifted, flickering with hesitation. "Everything I'm afraid of," he said finally. "The fear that if I let myself care too much, feel too much, I'll lose everything, including you." Her breath caught, and in that moment, she saw it the truth he had tried so long to bury under control. He had built an empire, but nearly lost the one thing he hadn't known how to fight for: connection. "You don't have to have all the answers," she said, her voice soft. "You don't need to perform. You don't have to hide from me, Charles. I see you, and I'm not going anywhere." For a long moment, neither of them moved, the silence between them thick with unspoken fears and unspoken grace. Then, slowly, Charles stood, deliberate, intentional. He crossed the room with quiet purpose, his eyes never leaving hers, as if searching for something he'd long been too afraid to look for. When he reached her, he took her hands in his. His touch was warm, steady, and for the first time, free of walls. "Evelyn," Charles began, his voice barely more than a breath. "I'm scared." His eyes shimmered not with tears, but with something more fragile. "I'm scared that if I let go, I'll lose everything. But I can't keep living like this. I can't keep pretending I don't feel something for you, that I don't want this. Us." Her heart clenched, his honesty settling in her chest like a soft ache. This was it, the moment she had waited for, the moment he stopped hiding. She stepped forward slowly, her voice a whisper. "You don't have to be afraid anymore, Charles. We can face whatever comes together. I believe in you, and I believe in us." He let out a breath he hadn't even realized he was holding. Then, as if something inside him finally broke free, he closed the space between them. His hands found her face gentle, deliberate, and then their lips met. It was hesitant at first, tender, testing. Two people learning to trust through touch, where words had always fallen short, but then the kiss deepened. The walls between them dissolved, leaving nothing but warmth and truth, and a connection neither of them had dared to name until now, when they finally pulled apart. Charles rested his forehead against hers, his breath uneven but steady. "I'm not perfect," he murmured, "but I want to try, not because it's expected, but because we need this, because I need you." Tears welled in Evelyn's eyes, but her smile was radiant. "You don't have to be perfect, Charles. Just be here. With me. That's all I've ever wanted." And just like that, the weight between them lifted. Not gone, but shared. The silence that followed wasn't heavy this time. It was sacred. They stood in each other's arms, not just as husband and wife by arrangement, but as partners, as equals. For the first time, Charles no longer saw his empire as his only identity, because now he had her, and in her, he had something even greater to build. Months passed, and with them, a quiet transformation unfolded. Charles no longer clung to the past like armor. Bit by bit, he laid it down, and in its place, Something softer grew. Trust, vulnerability, a kind of love he had never imagined he deserved. Evelyn had stood beside him through it all, not as someone who demanded change, but as someone who believed in his becoming. She loved him, not despite his flaws, but because of them. Because loving someone fully meant seeing both the cracks and the courage it took to hold them together. Their relationship deepened, and with that depth came new choices. Charles began to step back, delegating the pressures of leadership, trusting a hand-picked team so he could focus on what truly mattered now. One morning, sunlight poured into their penthouse kitchen. Evelyn sat at the table, coffee in hand, watching the city wake below. The view was spectacular, but it wasn't what caught her breath. It was the life she had built. With him. A life she never expected, but one she now couldn't imagine living without. And just as she took a sip, a familiar voice echoed softly from behind her. There was a time when Evelyn wasn't sure what the future would look like. Not with Charles, not with a life that had begun as an arrangement, born from obligation rather than love. But as the days passed, so did the doubts. Their life now wasn't about wealth or reputation. It was about the quiet laughter shared over coffee, the comfort in silence, the strength that came from choosing each other again and again. Together, they were building something no empire could ever offer, a life filled with purpose, joy, and belonging. That morning, Charles walked into the kitchen, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Gone was the tailored suit and calculated posture. He wore a soft sweater, relaxed jeans, and for once, his eyes held no tension, no fear. "Morning," he said, leaning in to kiss her cheek before pouring his coffee. "Morning," she replied, her voice warm. "You're early." He sat down across from her, fingers curling around the mug. "I've learned something," he said. "Sometimes the most important thing is just stopping long enough to appreciate what you already have." His eyes found hers. "And I'm appreciating this moment with you." Evelyn smiled, the warmth in her chest blooming quietly. There had been a time when she feared he'd never truly see her, that he'd always be too buried in his world of numbers and power. But now he reached across the table not to command, but to connect. And she saw not the man the world admired, but the man she had learned to love. "I've been thinking," he said, his tone steady, but laced with anticipation. "I want us to go to Paris." She blinked. "Just the two of us," he continued. "No meetings, no pressure, just a week, to be together, to live." It wasn't just a trip. It was a symbol, a way of stepping outside of the life they had built and seeing each other clearly without distraction. Evelyn's heart fluttered. "Paris," she repeated, a soft smile spreading. "I'd love that." "Then it's settled," Charles said, grinning now. "We deserve it. We deserve more mornings like this. More time where the only thing that matters is us." He stood, holding out his hand. "Shall we go pack?" Evelyn rose slowly, her hand sliding into his. But before they walked away, she glanced out the window, the city stretching wide beneath the morning sun. This life, it had come full circle. What began in fear had found its way to faith, no longer bound by uncertainty. They stood on a foundation built with trust, with compassion, and above all, with love. They would face the future not as individuals fighting alone, but as partners, standing side by side. And in the end, that was the greatest strength they had ever known. Sometimes, the most powerful love stories don't begin with butterflies or fireworks. They begin in silence, in fear, in the quiet decision to stay, even when it's hard. Charles and Evelyn didn't fall into love. They grew into it through trust, through mistakes, through choosing each other every single day. Their story reminds us love isn't about perfection. It's about patience, about being seen, being known, and still being held. If this story touched your heart, if it made you believe in healing, in second chances, or simply reminded you that we all need someone to walk beside us, then let it live beyond this moment. Don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs a little hope, and subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt stories that stay with you long after they end. Thank you for being here. We're so glad you stayed until the very end. Until next time, take care and keep your heart open.